I had 36 hours to leave because back then there were no flights, no seats out of Russia, no seats whatsoever. I started going through all the cities in the world that planes flew out of Moscow. Okay, and I found this village, a town in Tajikistan called Khujand, and it had a seat. Cost me about $5,000, $5,200 to get that seat. And it was economy, irregular economy. Okay, and I booked it, and I had 36 hours to go. So that's how I made the decision, and I think it was the hardest decision in my life.
Welcome back, everyone. So I want to take you back to 2022, 4 years ago. I want to take you back to when Russia started its special military operation in the Ukraine. At that point, I didn't know anything about Russia. I just read things on BBC occasionally, and to be honest, didn't know much about it at all. But the thing about when that line was crossed, it seemed to be like one of those once-in-a-lifetime events that seem to happen every year now, because that's what life seems to be like, is we seem to be hit by these things every single year. And so from my background, I was trying to basically say, well, if you don't know something, try and get some decent sources on the ground, try and find out what's going on. And so I went onto YouTube. I wanted to see what the YouTuber space was like. And I came across a very special guy. His name is Konstantin Samoilov. He is the host of a very popular show on YouTube called Inside Russia. And the term YouTuber does not do him justice. He is an economist. He's a community builder. And in my view, he is a genuine correspondent about Russian affairs and has been for many years, far exceeding some of the official correspondence in this area. His content reminds me of a very old radio show that some of you may remember called the Alistair Cook's Letters from America. Well, essentially, this is letters from Russia, from Konstantin. He has a real down-to-earth, easy access content that anybody can kind of, without the background in Russian culture or history, can access. I can't recommend him enough. And he's been kind enough to join us today. So welcome to the pod, Konstantin.
Thank you so very much for having me, Mark, Howard. It's my honor to be here.
Konstantin, could you maybe just for our listeners who have not come across you or your content before, could you just maybe just start telling us a bit of your life journey, where you came from and how you ended up doing what you're doing today? Just take us on that journey.
I am close to 50 years old. I was born and raised in the USSR and then Russia. And at age 20, I moved to America. And I had a nice life in the West, in America. And, had a family, 2 kids, and returned to Russia. Spent another 20 years between Russia, Ukraine, and Uzbekistan. I am a father of 5 children. I am a husband of a wonderful lady and a son of a great mom. I worked in construction of power facilities for about 20 years. I was a C-level executive and had a very nice life in Moscow until 2022 when Russia invaded Ukraine. In about 2018, I started YouTube channel, and I called it Letters to King. So my YouTube channel was about explaining Russia, real Russia, to the world, because as a hybrid, I consider myself a hybrid. Perhaps think it's mutant, whatever fits. But so I know both worlds. It happened to be that I grew up in Soviet Union, Russia, and I spent many more years. And then I also, came to the West, lived in the USA, and absolutely loved it. And I know quite well both cultures, and I have ties to both cultures. Not just, I've learned about them. I lived both cultures, and I speak English fairly well, enough to be understood and to understand others. My native language is Russian, and I felt like there was a big gap in understanding real Russia in the West. There's plenty of information out there. There's no question about that. But like how things really worked, how Russian people really lived, how the ways they had, that was unexplained. And I started a YouTube channel as a hobby. And I never thought it would become big. I just enjoyed making videos. I enjoyed, filming live. I enjoyed editing and uploading. It was fun. I started doing live streams because, when you walk around Moscow, Rostov, and take audience to a place where you truly love, and you show it how you see it through your eyes, I think that's very important. So, and then Russia invaded Ukraine, and the whole hell broke loose. Okay. So I changed because from being an inactive Russian citizen, I turned to someone who, all of a sudden woke up and realized what had been going on to my country and what tragedy. And I also realized I am responsible for that because for 20 years, I lived in Russia from 2022. So all those years, I didn't take an active political stand. Okay, I paid taxes. I knew of many bad things that happened were happening in Russia, like corruption, and I didn't do anything about it. I saw what Putin and his friends were doing to Russia, how they were transforming, bit by bit. And I bear more responsibility than other Russians because, if a person is born and raised in Russia, then it's really hard to compare with other countries. On the other side, I knew how things worked in the West. I knew the USA. I've been to the UK, fantastic place. I traveled all around the world and I saw how things could be so different. Okay. So, I started using this YouTube channel, my YouTube channel, as a weapon against unfairness, against the war, against the corruption, against the totalitarianism that is in Russia right now. And, I obviously could not stay in Russia. I stayed for 6 months and I did daily show every single day. I'd go live and tell people what was really happening in Russia. That very turbulent time was still turbulent. Back then, no one really knew what was going on. It was changing a lot. And I was forced to flee Russia in September of 2022. I had 36 hours to decide. Well, after I decided and booked tickets, I had 36 hours to prepare. I currently reside in Uzbekistan. I'm homeless, countryless, and I am fiercely fighting the unfairness, the darkness that is happening in Russia. I consider it my stand, my mission. There's fire inside of me, a lot of anger. I'm trying to help others as much as I can. I've founded Tashkent Breakfast Club. When I ended up in Tashkent, Uzbekistan, I found about 40,000 Russian men just like me wandering around the city. And I started, and every one of us thought the life ended for us. That was it. Because we didn't know what to do next. We just got out of Russia, and it was the whole rush, just to get out. And then once we were safe outside Russia, we started thinking, what's next? Nothing. Okay, so everyone went through a complex of mental problems, and I started getting people together every morning for breakfast. I was just a support group for Russians who fled. And then I decided that wasn't enough. So I started inviting Ukrainians who also are Tashkent to join us. And my idea was to just put people, at the same table and have them drink together and break bread together. At least the Ukrainians would see that not all Russians are beasts. And Tashkent Breakfast Club is still alive and healthy. We've grown over 1,000 members. We still do the same thing. And on the way, I decided to do something more, and I've established a nonprofit foundation in the USA. And with the team right now, we're a team of volunteers. We're helping displaced Russians and Ukrainians find new home in America. So I'm trying to do as much as I can to help others who are in difficult situations. And of course, I do my daily shows and I tell of Russia. I have my own outlook on what's going on in Russia, my angle, and it's based on work experience, on my life experience. And that's basically what I do these days.
Let me ask you about a couple of decision points in your life then. Why did you, it's right, you just started as a hobby initially. That was your first decision. Were you making content about Russia to start with? Was that just a hobby thing, or was there a deeper decision behind that to start the process all those years ago?
I remember the moment when I decided to start the YouTube channel. I was writing an email to my friend King Weinstein, a real estate developer in Maine in the USA. And then he asked me about Moscow real estate. And then I remember writing him a letter for 30 minutes. And then, comprehensive report basically. And then it struck me. I said, look, this is actually interesting. It could be interesting to so many people. So I need to share this because no one knows this about Moscow outside Russia. And I thought initially about starting a blog, but then blog, 2018, everyone was doing YouTube. I figured, hey, filmmaking, filming, camera and the microphone, that's sexy. It's nice. I like that. So, I filmed the video and I liked it very much. I was hooked and I started it as a hobby. So, imagine me back in 2018, 19, wearing a suit, tie, white shirt, going to work, having an office in a nice office building in Moscow and doing very important things like building power plants. I was in charge of business development of large construction corporation. And then I start filming things, and people started noticing at work and they were asking me what I was doing. I told them, look, I just would like to start a YouTube channel. And everyone thought I was crazy. I said, Konstantin, you're a serious guy. Okay. You have great job. You are known in the industry. What do you do? What are you talking about? But then I figured even if I had 100 subscribers, that would mean that I would have 100 people who would genuinely tune in to my podcasts or, films or videos and would get something interesting, educational for them. And I said, look, if I gave myself a few months and I figured if I reach 100 people, then that's it. I continue doing it. If I don't, I just finish YouTube. And I reached 100 people fairly quickly in a few weeks. Okay. And then I said, oh, okay, that's great. That's I keep on doing it. And then in the process, I kind of fell in love with the process of YouTube. This is a very unique hobby or unique occupation. It's a little bit of filmmaking. Okay. And I genuinely like it. And I enjoyed doing it any money for a few years. And I kept on filming once a week. I would upload something and then I didn't give up. And then the war started and then my audience just shot through the roof. So it originally was a hobby and never a business. It still is not a business. I'm demonetized by YouTube, I don't earn anything from Google. So it was hobby and I'm very glad that I started that hobby.
We should say that you've got far more than 100 subscribers now. I think at last time I checked, you just, the thick end of 500,000 subscribers with millions of views on YouTube. So I think you've been very successful in that. Sorry, Howard, did you want to come in there? Sorry.
I was basking in Konstantin's story. I mean, what I like, it's not a rags to riches story. That's far too little a way to describe it. We have a human being who has a view on life and has a normal family life like we all aspire to, a good job, loves his country, but isn't blind to the things that affect him and his world. And I really see that in the events that are going on right around the world all the time. None of this is unique to Russia. And I know a lot of attention right now is on the USA and areas like Iran and Venezuela and so on and so forth. But it applies just as much in the UK and in other European countries. It's not one culture. It's a behavioural change in a state that any state could go down with the cost on the members of that nation, the normal, ordinary people, which we all are. And for Konstantin to think, for whatever reason, I want to comment and share my life. I'm from Yorkshire. I would watch and be proud of making video content about Yorkshire because I love it. I'm not blind to its many shortfalls like Konstantin. I mean, I'm a bit older than Konstantin. I'm a grandfather and I've been all over the world. I love traveling the world. I hate going away from home, but I love experiencing new people, new cultures and new experiences. And I've never yet found a country or a nation or a culture where despite politics, despite philosophies, people weren't just people and had good ideas of good and bad and family and respect for others and kindness and honesty. And that's a hell of a thing that we all share. And for Konstantin to go out and turn that kind of aspiration into a product for fun, and life should be fun, and then, sadly, for other events to come along to make it suddenly a priority. Not that it's not important, it really is. Where would we have gone for that information without Konstantin and people like him? But at least we had that source. And even for a bad reason, suddenly his information has extra value, because in a world where you cannot trust information and you cannot trust sources, if you have somebody who you trusted before the proverbial hit the fan, and then the hit hits the fan and he explains to you what's happening in an honest way, in a truthful way, in a humble way, that's gold dust. And for me, as with my personal human head on, as a human being, family man and all the rest of it, but also as a member of society and a former professional intelligence analyst within law enforcement, but that crosses many areas of, shall we say, state work and local work. It's a very loose term. I would have always given gold for that kind of information, because the quality of information that we receive has a massive effect on what we think about certain things and the decisions that we make. And one of the things that I really worry about these days is how our information feed is so controlled and skewed to try and persuade us to think things that other people want us to think. It's only people like Konstantin that give us what you might say a far more straightforward and honest and trustworthy view that make it worthwhile listening to anything. Everything else is just noise or it's propaganda. And I'm not like Konstantin. I completely accept it's not perfect. It's one person's perspective. But hell, I'll take one person's honest perspective over organisational or state or business products any day, because you know which one is likely to have your best interests at heart.
And I agree with all that. I would only add that I think, because I came to Konstantin's content halfway through his career, but when I found him, I went back to the start and rewatched. And what struck me was when you talk about something hitting the fan, that's how humans think, right? We think on the Sunday night, everything's fine. And on the Monday morning, the bad thing happens and suddenly the world changes. But actually, things can happen quickly, but some of the worst things happen slowly, almost imperceptibly over time. And what you see with Konstantin's content is this ever slowly situation getting worse, day by day, week by week, month by month. And I think that's a lesson. It's easy. When we were talking before we were recording, I'm embarrassed to say I was so ignorant of Russia that I think it's because in the West, we don't really have, unless we actually meet a Russian in real life, there's not much Russian representation in our media. And what Russian representation there is highly stereotypical, highly polarized, theatrical, over the top. I would probably go so far to say very little to do with actual Russians. And I think it wasn't until I saw his content I started actually thinking, this guy is like me. His country is like mine. Our countries are not all that different, but he's watching it piece by piece go away. And so, Konstantin, that leads me to my second question, if you don't mind, which is, you've talked about your decision to record. If you're comfortable telling us, would you tell us about your decision to leave, about that inflection point?
Well, in September of 2022, I left for the second time. First time I left was late March of 2022. And the reason I did so, fled the secret police. You got to understand, it was a very, very strange time, strange days in early 2022, because I had never thought in my life Russia would ever attack Ukraine. Moreover, I was an opponent of this opinion, and I was trying to prove everyone, saying, look, just all rumors, it's all hype. You're overhyping it. And then all of a sudden I wake up and I see rockets flying and Putin telling everyone, I made the decision to attack Ukraine and start the war. I was devastated. My life changed. I worked in a company that operated in 3 countries: Russia, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine. I spent 1 year living in Ukraine. I have ancestors that came from Ukraine, judging, but one of my ancestors' last names, right? I know Ukrainians well. I still have friends there. I worked there. I worked in Zaporizhia and Odessa, and I was devastated. Okay, it's like your life changes abruptly. Someone just knocks you right off your feet. And I started making videos and doing live streams every single day. And then I was the only person, English-speaking Russian on YouTube, translating from inside Russia. Because, before the war, there had been quite a few YouTubers, and I knew them it's a small world, right? So those in Moscow, we knew each other personally. We got together and, we hang out. But everyone got scared. And I don't blame anyone because it was very scary. I was the only voice out there. That's why everyone started tuning into me. And I think only 2 or 3 weeks later, a couple guys started speaking their minds. Zach the Russian, Nikki Proshin. That's pretty much it. And then I was outraged by what was happening. This oppression laws weren't even there. Okay, we could speak freely until mid-March or so. And I was speaking very freely. And then people started reaching out to me and asking for interviews. And one of the guys, Philip Gallagher from Ireland, a producer, a reporter, contacted me, said he wanted to interview me for RT1. That's Irish TV, big media company. I said, yeah, sure, why not? I mean, you gotta understand, I'm just a regular guy at the regular job, executive, but, I'm in charge of a few things, developing my company. And all of a sudden, the reporters start reaching me and asking. And I never turned anyone down. So I sit in my kitchen. It was a very simple setup. And he asked me questions, very, very acute questions about Russia, what I thought of the invasion, what I thought of Ukrainian cities being bombed. And I spoke my mind, my heart, really, not my mind. And then little did I know that they were going to take that interview. And then they were pretty open about it, but I didn't know how media worked at the time. So they said, do you mind if we air it on TV? I said, no, I don't mind. So I tell it to you. So then he gives me the date, he gives me the link, and I see that it's RT1, it's Irish premier TV station, and it's prime time. I think it's weekend, and it's 9 p.m. news, and they have like 30 minutes of reporting. And the first 6 minutes is how Ukrainian women are fleeing Russian missiles, and then men taking them to borders, and then come back to fight, to defend Ukraine. It was devastating, to see those people. It's the war, okay? And then after that, 6 minutes about me, my interview, and they do B-roll of Putin, and I speak, Putin can't do that, that's criminal, and all that, this big face of Putin. And then when I was seeing that, my heart dropped, really. For the first time, I couldn't stand up from my chair, weak knees, that's the word, and my palms of my hands started sweating, okay? So right after that interview was aired, 6 minutes, right? And I had a few moderators helping me, not coordinating, but just like friends, and then they said, you got to get out of Russia. And all night, I was actually cleaning my emails. I thought they'd knock on my door next morning. And I cleaned all my emails. I had a couple of hours of sleep. I woke up. I told my wife, it's a big letdown, I didn't know how to tell it to my wife because I have kids. We have 3 kids living with us, underage at the time. And she looked at me and said, you got to get out of here. Get the hell out of here, out of Russia. And I called my boss and I said, look, the CEO of the company, look, I might have let you down because if they arrest me, I won't be able to. I had a very important role in the company. And he started screaming at me, said, go to the airport right now. Get out. Any ticket outside Russia. So I literally put my stuff together and I went to the airport. I bought a ticket to Uzbekistan. I worked in Uzbekistan. I spent 2 years. I had my own company. I took a sabbatical from the energy business, and I had offices in Fergana and in Tashkent, and I have friends here, and that was my first choice. Okay, I didn't have any other place to go to. So I flew to Uzbekistan and I spent here a month. And, I started making inquiries with attorneys in Russia about that interview. And everyone kept telling me, look, there's such a mess right now. And, your interview, it's just no one really cares. Okay, so you're safe. So I returned to Russia. I spent summer of 2022. And then the clouds started, getting thicker over my head, because I, at the time, in August and September, was, again, the only one person who was speaking openly. I didn't speak in direct language, but I spoke between the lines, and I made sure everyone understood. A lot of people were watching me at the time, and I was feeling with my gut that they're gonna go after me, because I was like a thorn, for them. And mobilization was announced September 21st, 22nd. Anyway, I figured that would be it. They would take that opportunity to get rid of me, basically mobilize me and send me to the meat grinder. And I was hesitant. You know how difficult that is to leave your life behind? Because I had worked so much to buy real estate in Russia. We had 2 cars. I had nice career. I had friends. Russia was my life. And then I was trying to make a decision to basically just get up and leave everything behind. I couldn't even sell anything. Cars, apartment in Moscow, because those just this chaos was happening. And then it took us quite a few days. It was a very hard time for me and my wife. And my wife was very supportive. Fortunately, we are on the same page with her, because I saw a lot of other families broke up because of different views, husbands and wives. And we discussed, we just walked around Moscow and our home in Moscow and in local forest, and we just discussed and thought and planned. And she was pushing me, but I was hesitant. And I'm a Christian, I'm a believer. And God sent me a signal. I was sitting on Saturday morning, my wife was cooking breakfast, and I was sitting there and just thinking, and all of a sudden, one of the subscribers of the channel sent me an email. Said, Konstantin, this is Rafaela from Germany. I'm a Christian, and I had this just appeared in my head, that I need to send it to you. And it was a verse from Bible, and it said something like, rely on me, just don't be afraid. I will not leave you. And, just rely and, be brave. And that was the answer to my question that I was asking at that very same moment. Okay. So I just silently showed that telephone screen to my wife. She read it, and I made a decision right then. I had 36 hours to leave, because back then there were no flights, no seats out of Russia, no seats whatsoever. I started going through all the cities in the world that planes flew out of Moscow. Okay, and I found this village, a town in Tajikistan called Khujand, and it had a seat, and cost me about $5,000, $5,200 to get that seat. And it was irregular economy. Okay, and I booked it, and I had 36 hours to go. So that's how I made the decision, and I think it was the hardest decision in my life, and the most painful too.
It's hard to put into words. I think it has been a sacrifice, a massive sacrifice. And I think, as Howard alluded to, there's not been much in the way of kind of ground level reporting throughout the whole process. And I think your perspective of being I would say a proud Russian, someone who had a deep love of Russia, and to go through those phases and then to go to that inflection point and then have to leave. Yeah, it's just incredible. So you've paid a lot, more than most, but I think, as we said off air, I think it's important to recognize that, to me, your work has 2 important things. You have documented a unique time in Russia's history in more detail than many others, including from official journalistic sources, and that has massive value and will have value for years to come, in my view. But the second major value, I think, is that your lesson isn't just about Russia. Your lesson could be about many other countries. There are Americans right now who are seeing certain fundamentals of their country change. Even in the UK, there are fundamentals in our country that me and Howard have seen you start to see things sometimes. And yeah, it's not always a singular bad actor with an agenda. Sometimes it can just be an adverse outcome because of how crazy the situation is. But it's a real lesson to everybody listening to pay attention, that there's nothing special about your country, whichever country you're living in. The country is essentially an expression of all the views of the people of that country. And sometimes the good guys are in charge and sometimes they're not. And you have to kind of do everything you can. You weren't in a position to influence policy and you weren't in a position to kind of change anything, but you were in a position to document what was happening. Day by day, literally, your content, every single day, this has happened, this has happened, this has happened. That must have been exhausting, but it's important in a historical context. I think it's important for people to kind of grasp that. And that it bypasses, again, we were talking off air about how a lot of content is sensationalized and, overly theatrical, and they want the big bad guy and they're chasing the headline, right? They're chasing the kind of narrative there, where yours is just, this is what happened today. This is what happened the day after. And that it slowly builds over time. Can I ask you, you've talked to us a lot about these two cultures, about the Western culture and the Russian culture, and you think of yourself as like a bridge between those two. Can you explain to me what it's like? What are the features of those cultures, and how do you define those kind of cultures? Do they have any solid characteristics? Are they kind of two distinct things? And how do you bridge that gap? Because that seems to be an incredible challenge that you seem to do almost without thinking about it.
When I first came to the USA, I was fairly green young man of 20 years old. I had never left Rostov except for a couple occasions, the city where I grew up, until I left for America. Imagine my shock, imagine my fascination. Russia was a mafia state back then. The state mafia, but the street mafia, there was nothing in Russia. We were just trying to transform ourselves from communism into capitalism to normal life. And we were in the middle, not even in the middle of that transformation. And then I land to the USA and I see this fantastic shining hill, shining, town on the hill, and I'm fascinated with it. And I also was fascinated how close Russians and Americans were culturally. It almost seemed like Russians were Westerners, so close to Western values, Western, culture, Western ways. Now, I am Christian and I have 4 core values. Okay. And that's something that my grandparents and my parents gave to me. In communism, they are God, family, freedom, and hard work. Okay. And this is, no matter what happens, these are my values. I don't change them. That's who I am. And in my messages, I project, I don't even try. I project. I am who I am. Okay. And when I came to America, I felt right at home. I was amazed and so similar. But there's one huge difference, and I later understood the difference. People in the West understand the value of freedom, value of, freedom, and they take responsibility for their lives in their own hands. And they don't blame anyone for failures. Well, for the most part, there's some individuals, but that's just, certain characters. But then in the West, your life is up to you. You are free to do anything you want. And the government certainly doesn't decide for you what to do, what not to do. It cannot. The government is there to serve you. Okay. And in Russia, that was a completely different story. That's where the two cultures differ a lot. In Russia, people don't feel, they didn't, and they still don't. They don't feel that it's their their lives are the life is their responsibility. Okay. They feel that there is something bigger than them, the state, the rulers. They decide their lives. And therefore, Russian people do not feel responsibility for the actions of the country. Because, hey, I'm just a little guy, I don't decide anything. I didn't decide to start the war with Ukraine. I didn't decide to press that button. And nothing I could do. And then they sigh. Usually, that's, what can I do? Nothing. And that is the major, major difference. And everything else, Russians are a lot like Americans. And I'd say, the Englishmen are very unique. I like your style. I like your culture. I like your history and humor, fantastic. But you're a little different. But still, the core idea of the West is the same. Because the West actually came from you, from Italians, Germans, and the English, right? So, and then it spread to the entire world. So Russians are a lot of like you in many ways, in values. Okay, everyone in Russia wants to be happy, wants to have good life, wants to be rich. Why there's corruption in Russia? Because that's the only way how people can get rich. In America, in England, in Europe, people go and work. They create product, and they know that if they do a good job, then they sell the product. They get rewarded, and then they have a good life, honest life. In Russia, everyone knows that that's not possible. And we're seeing it right now because whatever businesses were built for 30 years, 20 years, they're being stolen by the state right now, by the secret police. Okay. And in Russia, it's if you want to have good life, if you want to be happy, provide for your family, if you want to, just the simple pleasures, you got to join the state. And you got to do what the authorities tell you to do. You got to comply with the orders. In return, they give you right to use the power that you are given to use to enrich yourself. Okay, that's the difference. I don't know. I hope I explained it at least somewhat.
That was really good. Go on, Howard, sorry.
That makes a lot of sense, Konstantin, except with my English hat on. And historically, the English have been one of the worst state empires imposing their will on the world of anybody. These days we aren't. We're a small third world country, but we have a history. We have done awful things. So it's not that we're coming from any place of higher ground, shall we say. Nobody's perfect. But I agree with what you're saying, and that's very much a Western perception of Russia and the East. But I have to say, as I've got older, I've realised or come to realise that in the West, we have, by and large, state control and state ceilings and influence. So that quite a lot of the feel-good factor that you talk about, that we can go out and earn a living, isn't actually true, or it's not unlimited, shall we say. It is controlled by the state. Some of that is for good, for the good of society. But some of it is purely for the betterment of individuals and the state itself that isn't there to serve the people that we would hope it is, even though our constitutions and our rules say that they are. So I think, by and large, a lot of people in the West have lived under a bit of an illusion in that sense. We've never had the big shock yet of what you and Russia have sadly gone through, in this case with Ukraine. But I wonder if it's coming. I mean, I look back, you talk about individual members of society saying, well, I can't control things. I'm a small fish in a big pond. I get that. We're all human and we're only a single human being. But look at the world wars, World War II in particular, where awful things were done in the name of a new state with a new leader and a new regime. The people passively supported that. So in my view, and I'm sure every member of that nation didn't feel like that, but they felt that they had to go along with it, if only through fear or self-preservation. The same happened in some of the occupied countries. We had situations like in France and Belgium and Holland, where members of those communities would cooperate with the state of the invaders to protect themselves and basically betray their own state. If you look at the US right now, you think of your four core values. I can see some of the national leaders right now in the USA speaking out about God and about freedom, family. And you look at those individuals and they think they wouldn't know God or true freedom or true family values if they were hitting with them in the face like a wet fish on a Monty Python show. They are just using those words as tropes, as levers to persuade the masses. And before I appear to be critical of everybody else, I see the beginnings of that in the UK as well. Each government that has come in has said, we're good, the last ones are bad, we will change things and give you all this bucket list of God, freedom, family values and the opportunity to do well. It never happens. They always profit, and the average member of the public, of the nation, their situation either stays neutral or gets worse. So I think, I worry that there's this misconception. I just think that the Russian perspective on life, this kind of phlegmatic, well, it's just how it is, it happens, live with it, I think is maybe more realistic than what the rest of us have. So I salute you for that. The other thing I wonder is, you talk about how this process took time over years and most people didn't really notice, or it wasn't sufficient to react. as a student of life, I think most processes go through something of small changes until it reaches a tipping point. It's the seesaw. And suddenly it might be only one more little thing, but then that seesaw tips and the world changes. You could, coming away from politics, you could pick something like climate change. I'm an ex-scientist. I believe in climate change. I don't know when or how and what the consequences will be, but my worry is when you watch the temperatures going up and all the changes that are going on, sooner or later we'll hit a tipping point where the globe says, this is not healthy for me. I need to kick you all off or die. You know, we are the worst, most invasive virus ever to hit the earth. Never mind COVID, it's the human being. We are the worst thing ever to happen to the planet, you could say. Certainly if aliens were looking down, you know, we are a petri dish where you think the earth needs a big dose of antibiotics to get rid of humans because they're killing the planet. So I also think when you're actually living something in that blinkered view over time, you maybe don't see the big picture that's going on because there's lots of things happening outside our environment, but suddenly it hits a tipping point. And where Russia maybe has hit a tipping point, and it's had many, I think the West is going through the same process, all countries, because none of us live in isolation these days. It's all about globalism. If what happened in Russia and Ukraine didn't affect the rest of the world, or we weren't aware, it wouldn't be an issue. It might be wrong, but it wouldn't affect the rest of the world, or America, or the UK, or Australia. Any of the any other countries in the world, if somebody coughs, everybody else gets a cold. And that's the problem right now. Everybody is doing different things and we're all going up these slopes of little bits of behaviour, and sooner or later something's going to be a tipping point and it'll be another catastrophe. I only mention that because a couple of weeks ago we had another entertaining guest on, another economist, a gentleman called Mike Blythe, who was very interesting indeed, talking about how economists change. And he made the point that after World War II, countries got together to form the UN to try and create a new world order. Normally, up to that point, they would have been parochial and selfish. They even were in the war. You know, England bankrupted itself to the US to be able to survive and stand up to the invasion of Poland. That was our choice, but we're paying for it today. That's why we are no longer global world leaders in part. I'm not complaining. That was my grandparents and my parents. It wasn't my generation. I'm post-war. But he said it's only these big events in history that force nations to come together and work in partnership, and even sectors of society. So I wonder if we're sort of approaching a really bad tipping point, some catastrophic event that makes everybody think we can't suffer these states and these leaders who behave in this way. We need to get back to basics and work together for the good of humanity, regardless of whether you are Russian, English, American, Chinese, Indian, whatever.
I'm watching lots of things from around the world at the moment, and I think there's something to be said for people who are doing versions of what Konstantin are doing, just in different ways. As in, an expression I've heard in the US recently is that political institutions, they don't affect the change. It's people who build the political institutions over time at the grassroots level, the people who build things. And sometimes it starts very small, but it grows. Your work, you're building communities. I think I've seen that replicated elsewhere. I think it's interesting to see other kind of communities build around this idea of, okay, what can we do about it? And I think, hey, we're on this ride. It's been a long story, right? Climate change is coming down the road. Other challenges are coming down the road. But what I would recommend about the Inside Russia to anybody who hasn't seen it is if you watch it, you do get a sense of, for all the stereotypes and all the weird cultural stuff that we see on TV and Hollywood, Russians are not all that different to you or I. We have so much more in common. You know, when you're watching people, you can literally see Konstantin walking through shopping centres and you've got people pushing prams, buying shopping, laughing, joking. They're just people. It could be Mumbai, it could be Moscow, it could be London, Delaware. Doesn't matter. It's all the same. But Konstantin, I want to come back to something you did do, and I'm going to try and although I'm trying to be more positive, I'm going to ask a slightly dark question now. One of your videos that impacted me the most is, as you know, me and Howard are from a police background. British police have a certain reputation globally. But you did a video called, I think it was American versus Russian cops. And
yes, I did two of those. Yes, I remember quite well. And that's actually very important. I'm glad you're talking about that.
It kind of, It was really impactful for me for a couple of reasons. I'll let you tell the story of the episode in a second. But the question, well, you told. Can you just remind our listeners why you did that episode and what the differences were, just in short?
I feel like I could be speaking with you for hours. It's interesting. Comparing Russian police to not just American police, but other police forces in the world is crucial to understanding Russia. Okay, and what Howard just said about how things are changing slowly, okay, and then reaching tipping point, it's all connected. Your question is connected to that too. See, Russia has always been under the rule of a strongman, one or a few strongmen, since Ivan the Terrible, the past 400 years. Ivan the Terrible actually invented Russian police, okay, the Praetorians, so to speak. He invented the force, believe it or not, but some parts of Russian state, those different regions connected to each other, they were democratic. They actually held elections, and then czars were elected and then removed. Okay, so Ivan the Terrible captured Veliki Novgorod, that's the last remaining republic, and murdered everyone there. Okay, that's a very dark page of Russian history. And since then, he expanded to the east, and he started expanding. It became that he turned whatever it was into a Russian Empire. He took Kazan, and the rest is history. And ever since, Russian rulers had some kind of department of oppression, department who oppressed people and made sure that rulers stayed the rulers, okay? And people, the plebs, knew their place, so to speak, okay? That's Russian czars, basically. There are two classes were born, the nobility and the peasants. And nobility, those who were around the czar, serving the czar, getting rewards from the czar, they were considered higher people. Lower people, the farmers, peasants, serfs. And then nothing changed for generations, for hundreds of years in Russia, okay? And Russian Empire, that living is not sustainable. I'm going to just remind you of Russian history. Peter the Great, 1696. Okay, Peter the Great is considered progressive czar. Okay, that moved Russia a great deal, changed it. So when he became the czar, what was the first thing he did? He organized what's so-called Великое посольство, the Great Embassy, into Europe. He basically got everyone together, all the nobility, and they traveled to Europe, to the Netherlands, to Holland, to the UK. I saw a house in London when Peter the Great stayed 1 or 2 nights while he was there. And what did he do? He pretended he was not the czar, but a regular carpenter. And he made everyone study what the advancements that the Europeans had. And then everyone in Russia knows that. Okay, that was the Great Embassy. My question was always this: why in the world Russians came to the Europeans to learn from the Europeans? Europeans had been already so advanced. Okay, why weren't Russians? That's a rich country, large, lots of farmland, lots of gold and metals, ores, whatever. No, they didn't know anything because something was done, was managed, was governed differently in Europe and in Russia. Okay, in the Netherlands and Rotterdam, I believe, Peter was learning how to build ships. Okay, and then he came back to Russia. He started building ships. He established St. Petersburg, and the rest is history. Okay, so just this shows us that the system that Russia has lived for 400 years is not sustainable. It is based on the higher class exploiting the lower class. And back in 1696, it was already not like that in Europe, because in Rotterdam, they were free carpenters. They were communities of carpenters, and they were protected from the state. And, they basically were the earliest capitalist societies, and they advanced, not Russians. Russians came to learn from them. It just shows you how two different systems work, okay? And Russia has remained that system until Russian Empire fell apart, and then the communists took over, and basically they became the Soviet Empire. The very same idea, only czars were replaced by this general secretaries and the Politburo, that was it. When I was growing up, I didn't know that. I was indoctrinated at a young age. And when I learned, my eyes opened in 2022, really. And I started studying history, and then I learned about that, and that was fascinating. So I realized that Russia in the 90s had very short period of freedom because the state disappeared. And that was liberating. It was like fresh air. And then Putin came back, and he's former KGB officer, and he started rebuilding the system that he knew. Okay? And then he's done a marvelous job doing that. He's probably even built a better system now. But it's the same system of the USSR and of Russian Empire of the Tsars. Okay? There's the Tsar, obviously it's Putin right now. His servants, the nobility, the counts and barons and all of that, his friends, the oligarchs. And then there is the apparatus, the government apparatus, that it's called in Russia the vertical of power. It's power agencies that make sure the political status quo, remains intact. And right now they feel threatened. So they've created so many new laws that basically stripped Russians of all freedoms. If you like a post on the social media that the state doesn't like, you go to prison for 7 years, things like that. And then they make sure that they send people to prison. So now we come to the federal police idea. When I came to America, I was absolutely fascinated because I realized there was no federal police in the USA, which means simply one thing. There's not one person, the minister of federal police, department or whatever, ministry, in Washington, D.C., who gives orders to all the policemen on the ground. There's not one. At first, I couldn't believe it because I'd been so used to this system of federal police where all the decisions are made in Moscow in one building by one man, basically. And that man answers to the big guy, to the Tsar. And the Tsar, sets goals for him, and the Tsar sets KPI and then rewards him, punishes him, okay? And people have no say. All they have to do is they're obliged to pay taxes to support the whole thing, right? So when I came to America, I was absolutely blown away by the fact that each municipality had their own police force. And locals paid for that police force. And then they would hire the chief of police, and he would assemble the police force. But they could fire the chief at any time. Just get together and say, you know what, we don't like the job you're doing. Fascinating. You know what? Up to this day, I tell Russians in Tashkent Breakfast Club everywhere that there's no federal police. They do not believe me. They think I'm crazy. Okay? So very simple idea. If you have someone with great power telling all the policemen what to do, okay, and you pay them, that person at the very top pays them. They execute orders of whoever pays them, okay? And then in America, it's municipalities that pay them. And every police car in America, it says to serve and protect. And at first I thought it was a joke, but it's really to serve and protect, because if you don't, you get fired. You don't have power over your job. Someone else did. The taxpayers do, the local residents. You work for them. The same thing with the politicians. That's the idea. Politicians work for you. You elect them. You give them power to make certain decisions on your behalf for a couple of years. And if you don't like it, you can say, well, get the hell out of here, okay? We'll replace you with somebody else. And the system of checks and balances exists in the West, in many countries, that when someone wants to take power, and coming back to that same topic that we started with, we're all the same. We're all human beings, okay? It's who we are. A lot of people out there, they have thirst for power over other people, okay? And the difference between Russia and other countries in the West is that you have checks and balances that do not let people to take over. And then once there's one man, then power corrupts. Again, we're all the same in Russia and in America and the UK. When the system of checks and balances, disappears, then the country becomes another Russia. Russia is not unique, actually. I mean, there's been so many empires in the history of humankind. So coming back to the federal police, that I'm still fascinated that in America, there's no federal police. In Russia, there's federal police. And my grandfather, when I was 4 years old, he was teaching me, he said, look, you see a policeman walking towards you, stop, cross the street, and pass him on the other side of the street, okay? Because police was not there to help us. Police was there to help the state to keep oppressing us, okay? To make sure that we don't revolt, we don't stand up, we don't speak up, and so forth. So, and then coming back to what Howard said, stepping stones. I call this system stepping stones. And in the West, I think you call it boiling the frog. This political systems, they don't change overnight. The politicians take small steps, step after step, and they're barely visible. But when they combine, the compound effect is basically just the country changes. And that's what you were saying about the tipping point. That's absolutely true.
Can I just expand on something you've just said there? You said this in the original video, but I think you just repeated it again there. And it's really important for our listeners to hear stuff like this, because this is yet another example about how we're all the same. You talked about how Russia had this centuries tradition of highly centralized power structure, the vertical of power, and they essentially kept reinstalling different versions of that. In the UK right now, and this literally happened this week as I was watching some of your old content, I'd watched the American cops versus Russian cops video, and you said a line that was absolutely crucial. You said, the key is that central government pays the cops in Russia. It's not local government. It's not the municipalities. And I think that's such an important point, because as we speak, the British government is trying to federalise and overturn 200 years of UK policing tradition. Because right now, you're right, that's all municipally controlled, it's all local. And even in our country, we're thinking about turning that on its head. And despite the fact it seems to have worked quite well for 200 years, we're about to change it. I'm not suggesting for one second that we're anywhere near the situation you describe, but it is important to recognise that I think countries can get this set into a mindset where they think, okay, it's no big deal, it's a small, tiny change. But these, as you say, the stepping stones, those stepping stones are very real. And people need to engage with those stepping stones every step of the way, because sometimes it's too late to intervene, right? I guess. Sorry, Howard, were you going to say something?
Only that I love Konstantin's perspective on it, which I agree with. As a father, a grandfather, a human being, and an ex-cop, having a healthy sense of humour that allows me to see the funny and satirical side of things is really helpful when you're looking at what is often a tragic situation. I agree with it. I mean, the UK and most of Europe went through the same process. We were not always democracies. We were, for many generations, kings and serfs and, the haves and have-nots. What worries me, in the UK, policing's different. You're right, it's democratic elections. They have become less democratic as politicians have got involved to take it towards a more federal control, like Mark says. But that's been happening for 20 years. But the principle was always, I police by consent. So I am one man. There are never enough, and I would not normally carry a firearm. And I had a high standard of behaviour. The community, if they weren't happy with the way I behaved, would complain about me and I could be punished or lose my job. I'm more than happy with that. I do believe public servants should be held to the highest standards if we're going to entrust them with this power. But there's also a practical reality. I would be one police officer in a community of many hundreds. If they decided not to comply with my instructions, they could beat the seven bells out of me. So my power was purely psychological. I policed by consent, by persuading them that what I was doing was for the best good of everybody and it was reasonable and fair in a common sense way, not just hiding behind a law. I think we've lost a lot of that. And I think the ability, by drawing law enforcement and any government official, including politicians, from local people rather than them being recruited. We have politicians now that are going to be politicians from the day they're born. They don't come into politics because they decided they wanted to change. That was their career choice. I think that should be an automatic bar for anybody wanting to enter politics, because you should only want to go in as the least worst solution. Like Winston Churchill said, democracy is an awful way of government, except for all the others. I'm not saying that's right, but this idea of government and control by other people is a compromise that we have to go through, hopefully to get what we want. But it's a balance between local needs and needs at higher levels. And I think we're losing that. But I love this idea of, hopefully, like Mark says, on a more positive note, people in all societies, like you have gone through, I hope they don't have the same pain that you've had, my friend, but without those people who are going to notice the change, discuss and share it with others to raise people's awareness to it in an honest way, inviting them to read, not forcing it down their throats. I think that's the only way that we can push back the normal people, the average human beings from all our societies. We're the ones who are the controlling factor here as to whether these individual bad people who are in it for themselves, and there's never just one, it's always a group of people, because you can't do it on your own. You have to have other people who are prepared to go along with what they suspect or should know is wrong. I think that's the only way we're going to survive. And the one advantage that we do have is these days, even with all the restrictions they put on people, we do have a greater opportunity to communicate with each other and share ideas and experiences. Go back to the time when Britain was a great empire, or Peter, or even Ivan the Terrible. How would they exchange information? How would people in the rest of the world know what was going on in a locality? How would they react to those events if it took years for their awareness to be raised about it? You know, it's like if we didn't have the internet, we probably wouldn't have known about the Ukraine war. We certainly wouldn't have had the detail and the first-hand video and audio footage, you know, rather than edited stuff.
And that's what I'd want Konstantin to take away, is that, and I get the sense you don't even think of yourself in these terms, but you are a journalist, you are a documentarian, you are a historian. Your work matters, okay? And maybe you don't get the feedback that you should be doing, but I'm telling you directly, you are. And you've done a better job than many of your professional colleagues in the same space. And I think the world owes you a great debt.
Me too.
Thank you. Thank you very much for good words. You know, when it was the first days of the war and I was doing there was no structure to my podcast. I would just sit in front of the camera and would tell people what was on my mind. And it was a lot, what I was seeing around me. And I was thinking a lot what to do next, how to proceed. And one thing that was just one thought that was just burning me inside was my son was 5 at the time. And I was thinking, what happens when he turns 20? He looks at my eyes and asks me, Daddy, what were you doing in 2022? Okay. And, you know, I certainly didn't want to be ashamed looking into his eyes. And when he turns 20, I'll be very proud when he asks me this question. Probably won't even ask because he knows now, but that was one of the points. And another thought was that Russia was changing in front of my eyes, in front of like everyone's eyes, so fast and so radically that I felt like it needed to be documented. And I've never considered myself a journalist, but I certainly did document. I keep records. My YouTube live streams and videos are there, and they also recorded. So, and again, thank you for your kind words. I would like to return to what Howard said. Very simple concept. I like to simplify things. Basically, people hold the power. Okay, that's everywhere. That's how life is, because we are responsible for our lives. We make decisions for lives, for our families, and we are responsible. Even in the Constitution of Russia, one of the articles actually says the power belongs to people. And every time they make this new crazy law that strips people of power, we block the way you communicate. We strip you of the internet because we feel it's not safe for Russia. Well, who do you think you are to strip me off the way to communicate with others? So, and I'm just amazed that Russians don't ask these questions. Okay, they don't even understand. But people hold their power. We are the people is a wonderful concept. And I learned it when I got out of Russia, because I was growing up in a different concept. People are property of the state. Okay. And these two systems, they've been, and actually, just like you said rightly, we're coming from the age of empires, where people were property of the state, of those more fortunate, strong men, basically, okay? Because fortune came from strength in the first place. And then, 400 years ago, that started changing. And the modern democracies were born. At least they started being formed. And all of a sudden, this concept, we are the people, was coined. And that's how the West and our modern understanding was born with democracies. Right? We are the people. We are the power. We are to decide for our lives what to do, how to govern ourselves. We govern ourselves, and then we have the state which is, this is a tool, our tool that belongs to us to make our lives better, because some things, they need to be managed from one center on a national level. Okay. But we make sure that the people don't abuse power. So we make sure that power is very little and that people rotate so they don't get corrupted. Okay. And this is a wonderful concept. In Russia, that's a completely different concept. The Tsar is the state. Without Putin, there is no Russia. That's been said many times lately. Come on. This is the truth. They've said that and they mean that. And the people on the bottom, they have no rights, and the rights are just more and more rights taken away from them. And they just stay silent and they say, what can we do? What can we do? So that's a completely different system. And the thing is, once you allow people with power to gain more power is sweet. It corrupts. You get power, you want more and more and more of it. Okay. And for better or worse, you accumulate more and you change system that way that the state becomes more powerful. Okay. And it works in stepping stones, small law, small change, amendment, action, order, and it accumulates. And then it's, when it compounds, that just, you wake up and you find yourself in Russia or a state like Russia. And in many of my live streams, I finish the live streams by saying, please, friends, don't make our mistakes. Learn from our mistakes. Don't make them. Don't let your politicians run wild, because if you do, you might wake up one day and find yourself living in Russia. Okay. I think right now we're getting to a tipping point. Something is changing. I feel like the world is spinning around my head because a lot of institutions are changing. I'm not sure. I don't know much about the UK, but I know a great deal about the USA. And I see how people who have power right now, first of all, they abuse it and they get away with it. It never happened before, or at least not so publicly and openly. And second, they want more and more power. They want to accumulate, they want to control the country and the people. All right. Will they succeed? That's a big question. But I have also got feeling that we're getting to a tipping point and something's going to happen. My bet is that something terrible will happen briefly, and then we will find another collective security agreement, just like we did after World War II, when different countries got together and said, look, something terrible happened. We don't want to have it happen again. So let's create a set of rules, stick to them, and let's have, security forces that, safeguard these rules. And basically, we've been living in the same framework of security agreement for the past, 80 years. Now it's changing, it's breaking. Okay. But there's no new one. It used to be NATO, but not NATO's future is under question. Okay. And I believe that something not very pleasant will happen. And if we're lucky enough to survive, because we might not, if we're lucky enough to survive, then we will get together again, whatever's left of us, and we will sit down and say, okay, you know what? We don't want this to happen again. So let's come up with new rules. That's, I think, how Russia is going to end. That's because it's going that direction.
I agree with you, and I think it's a global issue. It's very easy to point the finger at one nation or different nations. It's not the case. It's a problem with the current human condition. And I think what really stands out is, you're right, if we do survive, what can we do about it? Right now, we can do what people like you are doing: record and observe and share information to raise people's awareness. Because if we do survive, in an ideal world, if all of those people who wanted that power have gone, then the rest of us need to be in a position to come together and say, well, all right, we know we didn't want it like it was before, but what do we need to put in place that will prevent that? Because that's the question. What happens next? What's our plan? And that's maybe a positive conversation for people to be having. The one that really worries me about what you're saying, and I agree with everything, is where I've seen it going. These leaders normally have been of nations, so their fate has been tied to the nation, good or bad. Particularly with business becoming such a big factor now and globalism, I worry that, think of Amazon doesn't pay, or some of the big American organisations don't pay taxes in the UK or various other countries. They almost don't exist. They're kind of floating around in the ether. They don't belong to one nation. So if the whole world went up in flames, or one or two countries, those organizations will probably still exist in the ether because they're not tied to one or more nations. And that worries me. They have no loyalty except to their business, and they're promoting their way of life, shall we say. So what we need to do is not only look at what do we do if we survive, but secondly, how can we build global collaborations that don't use that loophole to bypass what we want as individual nations? Because I can't see us coming together as one nation covering the world, the kind of science fiction concept. Life, that's maybe a step too far for all of us at the moment. Not that I'm against it, but life isn't like that. So how do we cross that bridge of making sure that we can respect each other and our differences, whilst at the same time acknowledging our humanity and the points that we share, and making sure that whatever we do as individuals isn't going to disrespect or undermine or risk the survival of our peers, not only in our own society, but around the world? That's a question that really poses me.
Let me try and play us out on something. I agree with both of you to an extent. I'm going to put a slightly more positive spin on it, which is this. You are both right in that there's been horrendous humanitarian tragedy, which has led to, never again. And we had things like the UN Declaration of Human Rights. Forgive me, Konstantin, I don't know enough about the Russian Constitution, but I imagine there's still words in the Russian Constitution that you're quite proud of and quite aspire to, things that are quite strong. What I'm getting at is that words matter. Principles and ideals matter. And I think what Konstantin has demonstrated is words are one thing on a piece of paper, but you need a person to share those words, and you need a person to signal and lead and say these things matter. So you don't forget the bad things and you remember what's important. And I think that's something that, you've always, there've been times in your in your live streams where you have been quite honest and gone, I feel like giving up. I've had enough. But you've also come back and you've gone, okay, no, I'm coming back. You get hit, you fall down, you get back up again, you get hit again. And I think you are signaling to Russia and to many other people. And again, I don't want to focus too much. This is going to sound strange. I think the most important thing is it's not just about Russia. This could be anywhere. It's a human signal. It's a human problem. You have put yourself in harm's way to fight for your ideals. You have been truthful to yourself. You've been truthful to the things your grandparents and your parents taught you. And I think that is something we can all aspire to and maybe put more effort into, because we can't wait for someone else. Konstantin, you didn't wait for somebody else. You started documenting. Even to the point where you had to leave the country that you loved and uproot your entire family. You didn't wait for someone else. And I think, and with the communities that you've built elsewhere, other people are learning to not wait for someone else. And the words matter. So I think that's the positive part. I do think the threat is there. The threat is real, for sure. But I think there's some positivity there too. So Konstantin, is there anything else before we wind it up, or anything else you'd like to say before we go?
Well, I would like to thank you. It's been a pleasure talking to you. I've had intellectual pleasure. I wish all the best to your podcast. I'm not sure the size of the audience, but it should be big. And it's a fantastic time. Let's do it again sometimes.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Howard. And thanks for all you listening. And we'll speak to you again soon.